AYAs are underrepresented in clinical trials and unfortunately have one of the highest rates of being uninsured of any population. So this is really concerning for a lot of reasons and really impacts our ability to make a difference for their treatment and outcomes.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Manager of Oncology Nursing Practice at ONS, and today we're talking with Stacy Whiteside, Nurse Practitioner and Fertility Patient Navigator in the Department of Hematology, Oncology, and BMT at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, about increasing AYA enrollment in clinical trials. Stacy is also the nursing representative for the Children's Oncology Group AYA Committee. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Thanks so much for joining us today, Stacy.
Thank you very much for having me.
So to begin today, can you just give us sort of an overview of what does the picture look like for AYA representation in clinical trials, and why is that significant?
So of the 90,000 newly diagnosed AYA cancer patients diagnosed each year, estimates are about 3 to 14% of those patients are actually enrolled on a clinical trial. We know that clinical trials are vital for studying things like disease biology, improving survival, and improving health-related quality of life outcomes for patients. And this low enrollment really limits AYA's access to novel therapies that are coming through the pipeline and limits research to optimize their treatment protocols, specifically in this age group, and can affect their overall outcomes. AYAs are underrepresented in clinical trials and unfortunately have one of the highest rates of being uninsured of any population. So this is really concerning for a lot of reasons and really impacts our ability to make a difference for their treatment and outcomes.
Obviously a very significant problem. Let's dive a little deeper into that and let's talk more specifically about maybe some of the patient or system barriers that hinder that clinical trial enrollment for AYAs.
There's a limited availability of trials just for this age group. This age group encompasses a lot of diagnoses that there's not a lot of patients. So things like osteosarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, some of the other rare solid tumors. We don't have open clinical trials for these disease entities, and so there's no way for AYAs to enroll. Accessibility of trials can be an issue depending on the location of where the AYAs are treated for their cancer. If they're in an adult center, they may not have access to pediatric trials they may be eligible for based on their age and the disease. And vice versa, with pediatric centers, they may not have accessibility to some adult trials that they could benefit from. Different institutions can have varying degrees of ability to actually access and enroll patients on clinical trials. If they have limited research support at their institution, they may not have the infrastructure to have these clinical trials open at their institution, and then they're not able to enroll patients. And then it's provider driven as well. Providers sometimes don't know about clinical trials that are available in other places outside of their own institution. Medical oncologists and pediatric oncologists who both care for these populations don't always communicate very well across their networks. And so really it's important for the medical oncologists and the pediatric oncologists to kind of come together and communicate about clinical trials for this group. And patient awareness. Patients may not be savvy enough to come in and say, hey, what clinical trials are available for me? Oftentimes patients just come in and they're so terrified and overwhelmed with a cancer diagnosis that they're not thinking about that there could be more than one option on how they're treated. And so making sure patients are educated too is a really big and important part of this.
Absolutely. And I think some of those later points you mentioned really are universal for all challenges related to clinical trials, not even just specifically this population, though certainly there's some unique circumstances here. I mean, we know that there are associated costs with clinical trials. And so if it isn't at your home institution or maybe the next town over, then it becomes logistically challenging to travel, potentially stay at that location for treatments. And as you mentioned, this AYA group is in a very tenuous part of their life where they're like potentially be entering into adulthood, but because they've had this cancer diagnosis, they're maybe not financially established and there's just challenges that abound. But clinical trials are inherently challenging for enrollment anyway. As you mentioned, like just awareness of what's out there, both for the provider who should and could recommend those and provide that context for what would be appropriate. And then for the patient themselves, if they are wanting to do their own investigation and be savvy, like it's still a little bit disconnected on where to find access to all of the trials and where they're located, though we do have some sites that are improving that. But it is just a challenge all the way around. And so for this very unique population, I think those challenges only seem to be magnified.
Absolutely. I think they're definitely magnified more than any other group. As you alluded to, these are patients who are trying to start jobs. They may be in college. They may be in between their parents' insurance and having a job and their own insurance, trying to get out of the house and not live at home, and then finding themselves in a very difficult spot where they need a lot of support. It makes a lot more challenges for these patients.
So we mentioned in your intro that you are on a committee for the Children's Oncology Group, which is a cooperative group that helps with clinical trials. So can you describe a little bit about, maybe give us just the background on what the Children's Oncology Group is, and then can you discuss how the COG, the Children's Oncology Group, is collaborating to enhance this access to clinical trials for AYAs?
Yeah, so the Children's Oncology Group is a cooperative group of pediatric hospitals across the United States, Canada, and there's some other satellite institutions that basically are getting together and studying childhood cancers in a collaborative manner. They have cooperative clinical trials that they run so that if you're being treated for ALL, if you're in Los Angeles or you're in New York or you're in Columbus, Ohio, you would be getting a uniform treatment on these clinical trials because we know that these cancers are rare. So we're trying to group together so that we can share information and make advances in treatment. The Children's Oncology Group has cross-network collaborations with adult institutions, particularly for AYAs. The AYA committee through the Children's Oncology Group has a clinical trials group that specifically is looking at ways to enhance AYA enrollment in clinical trials. There are 11 current COG-led cross-network AYA trials that are open, 6 adult National Clinical Trials Network Group cross-network AYA trials that COG is participating in. So that's 17 trials that the COG is participating in a cross-network fashion. The COG put together what's called the AYA-RI network, and RI is a responsible investigator. There's 150 individuals from 120 sites that are really in diverse locations geographically, as well as kind of the populations that they treat, that are working together to enhance AYA enrollment on trials. And so responsible investigators are providing education to community hospitals near them. There's an enrollment FAQ website where satellite sites who are a part of the NCTN can have access to COG clinical trials, and it helps take their research folks through the process of how to enroll patients. There are webinars not only for the research staff, but for the medical staff, and providing peer support to providers who want to be aware and enroll patients on clinical trials. One of the benefits of the COVID pandemic has been the role of telehealth and how providers and patients can access caregivers that they may not have been able to access before because of challenges with travel and things like that. Now you can make a telehealth appointment with someone who may have information about a clinical trial and access in ways that we never had before. There is a National Cancer Institute clinical trial support unit, all trying to facilitate institutions to be able to access and enroll patients in clinical trials. And then there is also a community oncology research program called NCORE, who's also trying to help community hospitals who may not be NCI designated or have access to those big centers to kind of help them with gaining information on clinical trials and some of the kind of more state-of-the-art treatments that are going on so that their patients can access those as well. So there are a lot of initiatives, both through the COG and through the adult cooperative groups, that a lot of people are trying to really make this easier, both on the provider side to have access to and enroll patients through the enrollment logistics that need to happen, and making sure that patients have access to these trials.
Thank you for sharing all that. I think that's really interesting and certainly important. As you mentioned, it's a relatively smaller pool of patients in the AYA population. And so, to improve access, then it has to be distributed more widely across various institutions. And so you wouldn't want a trial to only be held at one place, because then everybody would have to go to that one place, right, to access it. And we know that that would be even more challenging than what the current situation is. And so to be able to offer that same trial at many different sites, it's truly the way that we can ultimately get a number of enrolled people to be able to collect that data and understand if the treatments that we're studying are truly being effective. And so it sounds like whether it's the COG or, like you said, other cooperative groups that are out there really trying to bring clinical trials to the patients in their communities and in the settings that are logistically convenient for them, and certainly better for their quality of life to not have to uproot and move themselves and their families potentially to other locations. So those are all, I think, really important initiatives that really can improve not only enrollment for AYA population, but also just anyone who is interested to learn more about clinical trials. Do you have an example or a success story that you can share just about how the COG's efforts to make clinical trial enrollment more accessible to AYAs has provided that opportunity for a patient?
I do. Actually, there was a recent study that just completed called S1826, and it was a phase 3 randomized study of nivolumab plus AVD or brentuximab vedotin plus AVD in patients greater than or equal to 12 with newly diagnosed advanced stage classical Hodgkin lymphoma. So a population that both pediatrics and adult centers would see. It was a NCTN cross-network study that was led by SWOG, the Southwest Oncology Group, participated in by the Children's Oncology Group, working together. And it met accrual actually 1 year earlier than projected, and really is the hallmark of a successful AYA collaboration between cooperative groups. The Children's Oncology Group accounted for 30% of the accrual of the 980 enrollments that occurred. And this study really was important not only from the collaborative efforts, but they really started utilizing patient-reported outcomes measures and health-related quality of life measures embedded within the trial itself, because we know how important hearing the patient voice is and the patient experience with how these trials affect patients. We can have the greatest trials in the world, but if it has really negative impacts on a patient's quality of life, what are we really gaining by doing that? And so incorporating those on the front end and throughout the study and afterward is really important, and something that we're going to be seeing moving forward with trials. So all around, just a really great coming out of the gate collaboration between SWOG and the COG and other sites that really kind of hit a home run to start things off.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And you're absolutely right. Your mention of including patient-reported outcomes, quality of life, other indicators aside from just shrinkage of disease and those types of metrics, they have to be all-inclusive because, like you said, if we aren't paying attention to those other very important indicators, then what are we really doing here? We have to make sure that we are, yes, we want to improve survival, but we also want to make sure that patients' quality of life is maintained or improved throughout the trial. And so those are really important things to keep in mind, both for the AYA population as well as all adult clinical trials as well.
Most definitely. And it really impacts patients' willingness to participate in clinical trials, understanding that we're not here to just throw things at them without a thought about what the cost is of cure. We're really looking at making it tolerable and getting the best outcomes that we can. And so patients really want to be a part of that because they want things to be better for people that come after them. And they're really invested more in the process when they are a participant and that they're a partner in the process and we're not just doing things to them.
Absolutely. And that's a barrier, again, for all clinical trials, is making sure that patients understand how they're structured, how they're set up. No, you're not just a guinea pig and we're not just poking and prodding you for fun. There are measures in place. There are safety mechanisms, checkpoints, things to make sure that there's IRB approval. There's just lots of layers to this, and that can sometimes be an important hurdle to overcome with patients and help give them the information they need to understand fully what their participation means, how the trial is designed to protect them and look out for their best interest, but also be gathering important information that hopefully can benefit them, but also will just benefit the science of how we treat a certain type of disease. So lots of connections between challenges that are faced uniquely in the AYA population, but also I think bleed over into just clinical trial enrollment and challenges with that in general. So it really is important to establish that level of understanding and that trust with patients, maybe even more so in the AYA population, because, they're savvy. They're not going to be taken advantage of. And so I think not that anyone is or should be, but I think that this generation of AYA patients is uniquely equipped to kind of do their own research and investigate a little bit on their own. And so they will ask those questions, and we have, as nurses, have to be prepared to provide that information and just make sure that they feel reassured and they feel equipped with all the information they need to make that decision.
Most definitely. They will definitely hold us accountable, and we have to be ready to accept that accountability and answer the hard questions.
So, what are some opportunities or strategies for oncology nurses just to contribute to the notion and the challenge of enrolling AYA populations into clinical trials? And how can we help change that picture to improve their representation?
So, one of the biggest things I would encourage nurses to do is become a member of your clinical trials network, whether it's the Children's Oncology Group, the Southwest Oncology Group. All of those networks have nursing members, and you get a lot of information if you're actually a member of that group. Get involved, become a member, go through the process because it's definitely worth it. Nurses are on all clinical trials committees. So when clinical trials kind of come down the pipeline, there's a committee that helps move that forward, that helps create and implement the trial from the beginning. And nurses really have an important seat at the table with creation of clinical trials. Nurses are in the perfect position to advocate for patients and be the patient voice during the entire process. And so I would highly encourage nurses to get involved in your clinical trials network. Follow organizations on social media. Believe it or not, I learn a lot of things about clinical trials through Twitter or X. A lot of the clinical trials networks put things out on social media about trials, about outcome. And it's a quick and easy way to flip through and just get some information that you may not see otherwise, and is quicker than an internet search or things like that. Educate themselves about the availability of clinical trials. What do they have at their institution? What's available around? What are the latest treatments for the disease groups that you see? And then help educate your patients. Utilize resources like clinicaltrials.gov. The NCTN has a great website that has a lot of cooperative group information, and it can kind of be like a one-stop shop instead of trying to go to all the different institutional websites. If you are a member of the Children's Oncology Group, find out who your AYA responsible investigator is in your institution and just kind of ask them, hey, what kind of things are we doing here at our institution to help AYAs with cancer have access to clinical trials? How can I get involved? What are things that I can do? And then make sure that you're educating people around you as much as you're educating yourself about the unique needs of AYAs. A lot of us are exposed to trainees at our hospitals, whether it's nursing students, medical students, physical therapy students, etc. Take opportunities as they present themselves to really talk to people about AYA needs and making sure you're advocating for those patients. And then lastly, just use your resources, your nursing resources, organizations like ONS, the Association of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology Nurses, APHON, have a lot of AYA specific initiatives and information within those. And so I encourage people to be members in nursing organizations that are active with taking care of cancer patients.
Those are all wonderful recommendations. I really liked how you emphasized social media as a way to, yes, there's obviously the downside. There's the bad side of social media, but I think
Of course.
in a lot of ways, it is a place where information is being shared. some of it's actually true. And as you're thinking of the AYA population, like this is where they're seeking their information, also entertainment. But I think that's great to hear that that information is being promoted on those platforms because that is where they're going to meet patients or maybe even just infuse information and knowledge to people before their patients. So I think that's a great tip to consider of just understanding where your population is seeking their information and trying to make sure that what they're receiving there is accurate. And as nurses, if we know what they're seeing or hearing, then we can always infuse our perspective into that conversation. If what they're reading perhaps isn't completely accurate or a little bit misguided, we can help kind of bring their understanding back on track of what we know to be true. I also really love your recommendation of being aware of if your institution is a part of any cooperative groups, understanding what those are. You don't have to be a clinical trial nurse as your official role to still be aware of what your institution is involved in and understand how you can at least promote their efforts. In a former life, I was with a practice that it was the GOG at the time. Now it's the NRG, but I was on a nursing committee for that cooperative group as well. And so it's maybe not as well publicized unless you're already in that group, but there are opportunities for nurses to be part of those committees and to sit and make decisions for a large group and have a good influence on the direction that cooperative group clinical trials take, as you, of course, yourself know, because you're on a committee as well. So I think it is really important for nurses, either if you are a clinical trials nurse, of course, but even if you're not, you have patients that at some point in their care will likely need to learn and know more about what trials are available, or even just what does it mean to be in a clinical trial. So regardless of where your role has you situated and kind of what your typical day-to-day tasks are, I think it is important to have that awareness of what your patients might need to know or how to connect them with the right resources and information. So if and when a clinical trial is what they need to consider, you can not only point them in the right direction, but provide some context and some education yourself so that they feel like they are equipped to make that next step or at least learn more on their own as well.
And I know a lot of less seasoned nurses feel a little bit intimidated to try to, they think, oh, how do I just walk into this network and say, hey, I want to be a part of it? But it really is pretty simple to get involved. And these organizations are really interested in getting younger nurses, newer nurses enmeshed into the organization to kind of fulfill the role as nurses age out or are stepping out of these roles to kind of keep things fresh and new and keep people invested and involved. So a lot of these have formal mentorship programs. So you're not going to walk in and get thrown to the wolves. There really is a good process for getting people into these organizations, and people will mentor you and really help you guide ways to get involved, put you into situations that maybe stretch you a little bit, but in the end, in the long run, it's well worth it to be a part of things kind of from the ground up. And really, it gives you a whole different perspective on how these things work. And I think it makes people better nurses when they're involved in these organizations.
Well, Stacy, thank you so much for your time you've spent with us today. As we reach the end of our episode, I will close things out with just a few quick fire questions that we always like to run through at the conclusion of our episodes. So to start that out, how do you think oncology nurses should be evaluating their own implicit bias about AYA enrollment in clinical trials?
I think there's a couple things that nurses kind of need to be aware of in thinking about AYAs. One we've alluded to a lot is that AYAs typically are in a very transitional time of life, trying to gain independence and needing support. They can have job, school, insurance challenges. Relationships and their peers are very important. Fertility is important. And so there's a lot of factors that weigh in where they receive care, how they receive care, and their response to care. And so sometimes you have to dive a little bit deeper to figure out perhaps what's going on with the patient rather than assuming that they don't come to an appointment because they don't care or they're not interested. Another thing that is impactful in this group is the role of ethnicity. There's a lot of diversity in the population and a lot of individual differences that can impact whether or not they want to enroll in clinical trials. We know that certain ethnicities are underrepresented in clinical trials, which could be a whole different podcast. And they may have biologic differences that impact their cancer treatment and responses. So just kind of keeping in mind that really the whole experience in AYAs most definitely, but also other populations is really multifactorial. And it's important to kind of consider all those things when you're thinking about their care.
Thank you for that. That's great information and good to keep in mind. What are some common misconceptions about AYAs and clinical trials?
I think, again, AYAs kind of get a bad rap. Sometimes they earn it, but most of the time they don't. They can be a non-compliant population. It's hard to get them to appointments. It's hard to get them to do things we want them to do. But oftentimes I think we just have unrealistic expectations. If you take the time to explain why things are important, this is a population that's used to having information at their fingertips. And so sometimes if they don't understand things, they're not likely to do what you want them to do. And so taking the extra time to really go through why things are important and understand why they're not doing what they need to do and making sure there's a dialogue about why that's happening is really important. Because I think at the end of the day, most patients want their treatment to be successful. They want to kind of balance life and doing well and really will do the things that we ask. But I think the rapport and the relationship is the most important part to really getting them to do what we ask.
I mean, you think that we would never think to treat pediatric patients and older adults the same, but it's this middle group that I think sometimes gives people a little unease of like, they're not peds, they're not adults. Where are they? And so I think the answer is that they are their own unique group, and the ways that we would be different for pediatrics versus adults. We also need to carve out a very different approach to care for this AYA population. And that's something that we have to continue to learn about and make sure that we are aware of as we are taking care of patients and unfortunately, seeing patients of a younger age group get diagnosed with cancer. I know at ONS, we are very aware and interested in how we can support our nurses as we care for this very important and unfortunately growing population of patients.
I think we also forget that we do a lot of educating and telling patients things, and we don't listen perhaps as much. And this is really a population where the listening really, really is important.
What's something about this topic that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
I think the voice of the patient is very important. And I'm thrilled that patient reported outcomes really have become such an emphasis in clinical trials. Because again, what are we doing if we're curing patients, but the price of cure is too high? And I think it's important for people to understand that a caregiver's voice, while important, is not the voice of the patient. There's been recent studies that look at the concordance between what a caregiver says the experience of the patient is and the side effects and what the provider thinks and what the patient thinks. And they're really, really different. And so understanding it's okay to have a surrogate person give information when you don't have any other option, but really the most important voice is the voice of the patient and the person who's going through the treatment. And so I really think patient reported outcomes are crucial to advancing care, particularly in this population.
I absolutely agree. And especially when you kind of overlay that conversation on just the concept of survivorship and realizing that survivorship and how long that can be for an AYA patient who is diagnosed in this early age bracket. It would be obviously the goal and wonderful to cure or stabilize their disease so that they do have a long and full survivorship period. But that's a different roadmap than if somebody is, say, in their late 70s and they get cancer. Also still want to make sure that their experience of survivorship is great, but that's a different time frame. So it's just so important, as you said, to make sure that we're measuring and having awareness of these important related outcomes, not just survival, not just effectiveness of drugs and treatment, but what are we leaving patients on the other side of that?
And it's a great place to be in cancer care that we have the luxury of now looking at, okay, we are curing patients, and we have lots of survivors and survivorship is getting bigger and bigger, our population of survivors. So we do need to now look back at, okay, now that we have these advances where we're curing disease, what are we doing with the long-term effects and how are we mitigating those effects and how are we empowering survivors to receive healthcare throughout their lifespan? I think all of those are really important.
What additional training or education do you think oncology nurses need just to help support AYAs as they evaluate enrolling in a clinical trial?
Knowing the clinical trial terminology, it sometimes can be overwhelming, and there's a lot of alphabet soup, it seems, with all these abbreviations for different cooperative groups. I think understanding sort of the lay of the land is really important. I think nurses understanding the aims of what studies are actually looking at is very helpful to be able to explain to patients, because we've all been in rooms where a physician goes through a big study consent, leaves the room, and then the patient looks at you and says, I have no idea what just happened.
Please say that again.
Right.
In my language, please.
Exactly. And so being able to have that conversation in a way that patients can understand, you have to have some background knowledge of what the studies entail. Even things as simple as what are the aims of a phase 1 study versus phase 2 versus phase 3. Even just logging on to these cooperative group websites and reading protocols, looking at protocols. You don't have to read a 150-page protocol, but sometimes I learn quite a bit just looking at the study background and why are they doing this study? What are they building on from the past that has made people think this would be a successful study? Really trying to keep yourself educated. And so again, that goes back to being a member of your cooperative group, and your nursing committee within that cooperative group really helps you have a leg up with being able to have these conversations in a way that makes patients feel comfortable, that you come from a place where you kind of know what you're talking about and you can communicate it in a way that a patient can understand.
Absolutely. And we talked about just the importance of listening and establishing trust with this population. And so if I'm a nurse, I'm not in clinical trials, but I'm in a generalist practice or even a subspecialty practice, and a patient comes to me and says, what do you think about this trial? If I don't have a way to give a response, if I don't feel like I'm informed enough to actually answer that question, that's going to impact and erode away at that relationship and that trust. And that might sort of trigger them to think, well, if my nurse, who I already know, doesn't understand this or isn't recommending this from the get-go, then maybe I should have second thoughts. And so it really does help to just promote that relationship. That's important to support patients, even if you're not their clinical trial nurse, just being able to tell them what you do know, give them that warm handoff to who could tell them more. All those steps are important. I love those recommendations of how any oncology nurse can just stay informed so that if and when they are in that situation to provide some information or education to an AYA patient, that they will feel like they have an informed response.
And understand nobody knows the answer to every clinical trial question. So it's really okay to tell a patient, you know what, that's a great question. And I'm going to reach out and get that information for you. And I will circle back with you. That patients maintain the trust that way. And they know that you're going to be honest with them and you're not going to try to make things up if you don't know the right answer. So I think how you handle those situations, even if you don't necessarily know the answer, and providing that feedback to a patient that you're going to get the answer for them, they really still maintain that trust and integrity of that relationship.
Absolutely. The follow through is so important. What are some additional resources for patients who want to learn more, or other nurses or even other providers who just want to learn more about AYA clinical trials or cooperative group support that is going on with the COG?
I would strongly encourage folks to know what's going on within your own institution. Find out what cooperative group your institution participates in. Are there any cross-network collaborations that your institution is working? And what clinical trials are available? Because just because something's available through the Children's Oncology Group, it may or may not be open at your institution. And so just having the knowledge to know, well, where is a place where I could go and find that out? Is there a place on the website that lists available clinical trials here? Again, social media really, it provides a quick hit of information. And if they're from sources that are National Cancer Institute, cooperative groups that are established, or medical societies where you know the information is reliable and accurate, really can provide quick and easy information. And you can give that to patients to also look at. Alwaysclinicaltrials.gov gives information about trials and can give a one-page kind of summary of a trial. And the NCTN website has a lot of cooperative group information.
Well, Stacy, thank you again for all of the great information that you shared today. I think this is an important discussion. And as I said, focusing on the AYA population is something that I know that ONS is committed to. So I appreciate all of your expertise that you've shared. Do you have any final comments you'd like to leave our listeners with?
it's really important to just remember every case matters. There are very few, even though at our institutions, when you're working on the unit and you have a full assignment of all AYA patients, and it feels like AYA cancer is everywhere, really across the United States and across the world, it's a very small population of cancer patients. And so the only way we can improve outcomes is by studying the patient experience. And so trying to get patients enrolled in clinical trials and getting them the most up-to-date, best care we can. And that's what really moves the needle for these patients. And just get involved any way that you can. Get involved with professional organizations, educating yourself, doing initiatives through your own institution, your unit, working with other nurses on the floor. Really, just any way you can try to stay involved really will make all the difference.
Thank you so much, Stacy.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.